So what I will do is that I'll give a brief definition of these terms, and as I go about the presentation, if there is any need to refer to something, please do not hesitate if you're not sure, so that I could flip back and give you the explanation. But just some of the key terms which I will be using throughout this presentation: GDP growth, which is an indicator of how fast the economy is growing. If you compare it to the household, in other words, it is how much income are you generating every year, essentially, or the growth in your income on a year-to-year basis. FDI, which we refer to as foreign direct investment, is basically investors coming into the country for long-term, investing in long-term enterprises. So, for example, a hotel project would be considered FDI, financed by foreign investors, not through domestic sources. Then recurrent account deficit, which is essentially the excess of your recurrent expenditure, wages, goods and services, transfers, debt service, over your recurrent revenue, which is your taxes and your non-tax revenue. Another description which I'll often use is the overall deficit, which is essentially the excess of your total expenditure, all what you spend, versus all the income that you receive from all sources. Also, there is a distinction which I want to make in terms of various lending products. There is something which we'll refer to as bonds. Now, there are two types of bonds. There is what we call an amortized bond, which is the typical way anybody in the economy, usually when they get a loan, a household, they would finance a car or a mortgage, which is what we would call an amortized loan, essentially. So you pay the interest and the principal on a scheduled basis, whether it's monthly, quarterly. So this is the standard one. We also have what you call a bullet bond, which is, and usually households would not normally get bullet bonds. What you would do is that the principal and the interest is paid at maturity. Only the principal, the interest, sorry, is paid on, let's say, quarterly basis, and the principal is paid at maturity. So the example would be, you go to a creditor, you want $10 million, it matures in, let's say, 10 years' time. So in 2024, you'd pay the $10 million back, and the interest payment, you'd pay it on, let's say, quarterly basis up till the date of maturity. Also, roll over, which is essentially, if you go to a creditor, you get a loan of $10 million. It's due in 5 years' time. So in 2019, that loan matures. The creditor would be expected to receive the principal in 2015. This is usually associated with the bullet bond. What you would do in 2019 is go to the investor and tell them, could you hold on to that instrument for further period of time? So you roll over the instrument. So you continue paying him interest at a regularly scheduled period, but the principal payment, you delay it into the future. Another term which we'll use off and on is what we call a haircut, which is a form of debt restructuring. In that case, what you do, there are various ways you could restructure your debt. You could extend the maturity profile. You could look at the interest rates. Another concept, which is the hardest form of restructuring, is a haircut, when you actually reduce the absolute amount which you owe the creditor. So essentially, if I had a debt for, I owed a particular investor $10 million, if a haircut would be that instead of paying him back $10 million in principal, I would pay him back $8 million. So I've reduced the face value of the debt. Macroeconomic context. What we see in St. Lucia is that we have had relatively low growth through basically the entire past decade, apart from the period during the World Cup, leading up to the World Cup period. So you had a acceleration in growth in 2003 and 4. Then you had another period of very strong growth in 2007, 2006, 7, 8, leading up to the World Cup. But if you take an average of the period, just for information, the bars represent the growth rate, and the line represents the GDP growth rate, and the bar represents your FDI GDP ratio. So if you we have had, if you take the entire period, we probably have average growth rate of around 2% for that period, which is way below what you would need to reduce unemployment, essentially. To keep unemployment constant, we estimate that you would need growth of at least 4% per annum at a minimum. To reduce it, or let's say to take it back to where it was in 2006 when it was at its lowest, you would need growth of at least 8%. Put that in the context of average growth of 2%, and since the financial crisis, average growth has been below 1%. What we see is a correlation between, or a relationship between FDI and GDP growth. If you, oh, what's this thing? Why is this thing doing this? So if we look at this period, you see we had a significant increase in FDI during that period, which is at least 15%, almost 15% of GDP, which is close to, I would say, let me see, at today's GDP, that's almost 500 million, I think, in FDI into the economy in that year. Now you could see that that basically led to the period of high growth in 2003 and 2004. If you look at this period, 2006-07, significant FDI. You're looking at in excess of 20% of GDP in 2 consecutive years. So that's almost, I would say, 10% would be, that's like over 700 million in FDI in each of these years during that period. And you could see that it sustained growth for at least a couple of years, and then since then, FDI has been relatively flat, and so too has been the growth rate. So when we often make the connection between FDI and the growth of the economy, the data supports that relationship. Because of the low growth, what we have over the period, this is well known about the high unemployment, relatively high unemployment average of around 23-24% during 2013. And partially, this contributes to some reduction in your inflation. The inflation level in 2013 was lower not only because of the weakness of the economy, but also commodity prices was more contained this year than it was, last year than previous year. Now let's look at the fiscal performance. What we see is significant fiscal adjustment in 2013-2014. The previous year deficit was at 9.2, sometimes say 9.2, 9.3. 40 was the exact number, sorry? Last year was 9.2 we ended up at. Sorry, the year before. 9.2, roughly 9.2. And this was one of the highest deficits in the world, which meant that we borrowed $328 million to finance that deficit that year. Last year, we brought the deficit down to 5.8% of GDP, which means that we borrowed $209 million during that period. Essentially, you have to borrow to finance your excess of expenditure over income, and this is the amount which you would have to borrow, which we borrowed last year. What we're trying to do this year is to keep along the same trend, and we'll explain why this is important as we go further in the presentation. But this was definitely untenable 2012-13, and there was need for serious adjustment. What we saw is an improvement in the current account deficit, which means that it improved from a minus 47 million to 1 million. Well, we had gone through some of the definitions before, but the current account deficit essentially is your, what we call your operating costs. Your operating cost of your business versus your operating income. So the household, you have an income from wage and whatever, if you have invested, your investment income, and then you have expenses, which would include your mortgage, your bills, everything in there. And that would give you your current account balance. So we moved from a deficit of 47 million to only 1 million this year. Now this is significant, but it's still not good enough, because essentially what you would want to move to is a position whereby you have a surplus on the current account and it will help you finance your capital expenditure, which is your investment, which is really what drives growth. This is what will encourage FDI into the country by doing capital investment to improve your infrastructure, etc.
And that's for 2013, 2014.
Yes, this is for 2013, 2014. Yeah. So as this picture showed, overall deficit, which is overall now, which includes your investments, your capital investment, we move from negative 328 million to 209 million.
Sorry, before we go to the next slide, could you explain again the first graph? I'm just realizing it was
The first graph just shows us a trend, and it shows total expenditure and total revenue and grants. So what it is showing us essentially is the distance essentially is your deficit, the distance between the two. So as you can see, total expenditure has always exceeded total revenue and grants for the entire period we have here, which starts from 2002-3 to 2013-14. And the difference, we capture it in two ways. We capture it by the nominal amount, which is 328 million. Let me see what options ignore. Right. Drop this. So we capture it in two different ways. We give you the nominal amount, which is in 2012-13, 328 million, or 9.2% of GDP. And in 2013-14, we brought it down to 209 million, or 5.8% of GDP.
And you're saying you're trying to maintain, that's the part I can't understand.
Maintain.
You would explain later, that's the part that I
Oh, why it's important to, what we want to do is to continue closing this gap between total expenditure and total revenue, essentially. Now, what we recognize is that you need further adjustment to reduce the recurrent deficit. I gave an explanation earlier, but what we see is that this was 2012-13. This was a significant adjustment in 2013-14. If we do not do, now in there in 2014-15, we do not have any wage adjustments, but we have other adjustments in there. And what we'll see is that it would worsen in 2014-15.
I don't know if you have that later on, but in 2012-13, that recurrent deficit is 150. What other contributors to that?
What we saw in that year was we had some huge debt repayments in that year, in 2012-2013, which drove it. Also, our interest bill went up. The interest bill on debt, previous debt, your interest payments also went up. And I think there was another category due to, I think there was an increase in communications, because what happened was that some of the bills from 2012, I think, were brought into 2012-13, from 11-12 were brought forward in 2012-13, and there was something else there? Oh, and revenue also. We had a major decline in revenue that year. So
was it similar for 10-11 with that 150?
10-11, you know.
Yeah, I realize that, but 10-11 was not that far off either.
Yes.
The two worst years in the last 10 years or so.
We'd have to look at the numbers to give you exactly what happened in that year, but we can explain this year for sure. And also, I think this year what we did was that the retroactive payment for wages, for the wage adjustment which we did last year, we put it in this year.
I see.
And so this is why you have this increase in this huge increase in the recurrent deficit, which was totally untenable. And this is why, when we were making the initial case to the unions as to why we didn't think we could support the wage increases, and we'll explain what happened soon after that. So you see, if nothing is done, essentially, we go back, we improve and then we worsen, which is not good, because what we want is to maintain some kind of consistency to help us hopefully sell our instruments on the markets, to allow investors, to give them the confidence to buy our debt instruments, and we'll explain that down the line, what has happened recently. Now, the adjustment was driven by an increase in revenue, streamline of capital expenditure. So essentially, we see revenue, total revenue on grants increased by 4.1% last financial year, giving you, with total revenue increasing by 6.7%. Total expenditure, however, declined by 6.9%. But as you can see, current expenditure remained very sticky. It still went up because of the wage adjustment, mostly. Capital expenditure went down by 25.2%, but we need to explain this. This 25% decline in capital expenditure is not a deliberate, most of it is not related to a deliberate effort by the government to contain capital expenditure and reduce it. Most of the capital expenditure reduction was associated with grant funding from the EU, associated with the completion of the new national hospital. We didn't receive it, we didn't spend it, partially because the commissioning of the new national hospital has been delayed. Around 7% of the decline would have been due to policy decision to reduce the level of spending. Now, we say streamlining of capital expenditure because we try as best as possible to preserve what we consider to be hardcore investment spending. And here's the major problem we have, is that despite all what we have done, current spending remains very difficult to reduce because of these guys here. Salaries and wages and interest payments. If you look at it, goods and services down by 5%. That's roughly 8-9 million adjustment. Transfers down by 9%. Yes, transfers to statutory, but part of this, I think, includes the adjustment to commodity prices, Mr. Fontana. That includes the adjustment of commodity prices. It will fall underneath it. With the removal of the subsidy on basic food items, it considers as a transfer because it's a transfer to the private sector. So we did significant adjustment in these two categories. This is fixed. You can't adjust this. This is your obligations because of past debt which you have accumulated. And wages went up by 2%. What we see as a result of the effort last year is that the debt at least has stabilized a bit. You see the path, it was on an upward trend for that period. So we had a slight upward trend and a stabilization, rough stabilization during that period. Then on an upward path again from 2007, there or thereabouts, and then there is almost a turning point. Now, to just stabilize this deficit, the effort you would need would be significant over around 3-4 years. Sorry, the debt GDP ratio, which is the amount of debt you have to your income. If you wanted to stabilize this even at the 70%, you probably would need adjustment of the magnitude of, I think, at least 200 million to stabilize it. So the adjustment to stabilize this is very difficult. If you wanted to bring it down to what is considered the prudential level established by the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, which is 60%, it would require some significant adjustment. So this partially explains why, even despite the hard efforts in the previous year, there is still much more work to be done. And what we propose in essentially is trying to keep this thing stable. It's not to reduce it. If you were to reduce it, the adjustment would be much more draconian. This shows that St. Lucia is headed in the right direction. Why, compared to our sister islands? We were here in 2012, right towards the worst performers in terms of the fiscal deficit and fiscal deficit. So what this graph shows you is that the vertical axis shows you the fiscal deficit. The horizontal axis shows you the debt level. So, for example, Jamaica is near balance, I think, on the fiscal deficit, but they have a debt level of 140% of GDP. If you go to St. Kitts, they have a fiscal surplus of over 10% of GDP, and they have a debt of around 110% of GDP. Okay, St. Lucia, here in 2012, around 70% of GDP with a deficit of 9.2%. In 2013, what St. Lucia has been able to do is to at least keep the debt level stable and reduce the deficit significantly. So now we on the we're moving on the more favorable side of this diagram. And the whole idea is that you need to keep that effort going. And we'll explain why again, because it's related to your financing and how you could finance your deficit and how does the market perceive you relative to the others. And the point I like to make about this graph is if you're an investor and you're looking at the region, let's say you're interested in doing a regional investment, St. Lucia does not look bad right now in this grouping. But there are a couple of factors which still works against St. Lucia, and we'll explain it later. Because if you look at this, you say, I want to invest in the Caribbean. You look at Trinidad, okay, fine. Jamaica with its debt of 140%, even though it's near balance on the fiscal, and all the other problems it have is kind of like not ready. Dominica, because it's at a much lower level of economic development and there are probably less opportunities there. So when you look at this grouping, especially amongst the OECS, St. Lucia should still be, you know, so if your intention is to invest in the region, St. Lucia should still be looked at favorably, but there are some issues which we'll discuss as to why this is still problematic. So, fiscal consolidation and the case for it. Why we need fiscal consolidation? Large deficits, it leads to high and unsustainable debt, it reduces growth. It increases your risk of fiscal distress. Fiscal distress meaning that you have expenditures which you want to meet and you just cannot finance it. It could also crowd out private investors because private investors get nervous when they see countries with large fiscal deficits and huge debts because they start worrying about how will the government pay me back eventually. Will they decide to take over my property or impose huge taxes on me? So this worries private investors. Also, debt service needs crowd out spending for development. As you can see, our interest rate is pretty high. If you look at it's around 16% of our total current expenditure. This means that that's money you can't use for other reasons. I don't know. Ignore again. This graph looks complicated, but it's a simple story. It says that if your debt to GDP ratio is below 50%, so essentially it's fine and it has a positive impact on growth. So if you're borrowing and your debt to GDP ratio is below 50%, I think like probably Trinidad is, I think, in the position. Borrowing actually has a positive and relatively strong impact on growth. Once you start going above 55, 60%, it tends to be a drag on growth. It tends to impede growth. And that's why most times we have a prudential level of around 60% and you try to keep it below. Generally for emerging market economies, these are economies which are not advanced, like Brazil, Trinidad, Estonia, a whole range of countries. The prudential level is 40%. However, in small states, they recognize that the cost of government is slightly higher, so then the prudential is set at 60%. Now, here's the most important point relating to the fact I raised about when you look at St. Lucia relative to the rest of the Caribbean countries, and despite the fact that they seem relatively well positioned, there are two factors which still affects us. St. Lucia has significant amount of debt instrument issued on what we call the RGSM, especially on bonds. Now, if you look at this green, I think this is green, I'm generally colorblind, but I think this is green, is St. Lucia. This essentially is the amount of financing we have raised from the RGSM in bonds. That's longer term instruments which mature 3, 5, 10 years. These are not treasury bills, which are the shorter term instruments. If you look at treasury bills, then you see St. Vincent is pretty aggressive there. I was surprised to see the data. So this is St. Lucia. In 2005, St. Lucia raised 75 million. Now this, another explanation, this includes rollovers. So it's what we call your gross requirements. So the explanation I gave for rollovers a while ago, when you go on the market, even though it's a rollover, it can still, in a way, be considered new financing. because you go into the market and tell them, can you hold the instrument? But it's really new financing. So we call that the gross amount, the total amount you went for. 75 for St. Lucia in 2005. In 2006 was the only year when we had other countries ahead of us. I think this is Louis St. Vincent. They issued some paper which looks like almost 100 million. St. Lucia was still at 75. But look what has happened. 80, 116, 128, 239, 195, 122. Nobody else is anywhere near us. Now, the important implication of that, it says two things. That investors had enough confidence to buy St. Lucia paper on the market. But secondly, what it says is that what happens is that most investors have a limit, what they call the prudential limit in terms of exposure or how much money they want to owe any particular creditor. It's just like if you go to the bank will look at your income and say, I do not want to be lending you more than 5 times your income. So what most investors have is this is the amount we want, the maximum amount we want to borrow from a particular island. Because St. Lucia has been so active on the market, and despite its relatively better position to the other countries, when you look at it in terms of the debt deficit, people are saying we have met our exposure limit with you. We do not want to hold any more St. Lucia paper because we've reached our limit. Now, the implications of that is you need now to go outside of the region. Now, if you go outside of the region with a deficit of 5.8%, nobody will lend you for less than 10% interest rate, 10, 11% interest rate. At the moment, on the RGSM, when we get money there, we get it at 7% interest. So this is the implication as to why, despite the efforts made so far, there is much more work to do. Secondly, market sentiment. Once again, you look at the region, you say St. Lucia looks relatively good compared to the other countries. But what has happened with the other countries? Dominica had a debt restructuring in 2004. Grenada, debt restructuring in 2005, 2014. Now, ignore the earlier ones, but let's look at Belize. So, Grenada, 2014, and the exact details of this adjustment is yet to be worked out. Now, this could have significant implications for St. Lucia, by the way. They're currently trying to negotiate an IMF program, and what they decide on the debt restructuring will have significant implications for St. Lucia. Belize did a debt restructuring which included a haircut in 2013. The Grenada debt restructuring, by all indication, will include a haircut, which means that there will be a reduction for investors of the absolute amount of money which they loan to Grenada. Antigua Barbuda had a debt restructuring in 2009. Jamaica had 2 in 2010 and 2013. St. Kitts had a debt restructuring in 2012, will also include a haircut. What it means is that investors now looking at the region, despite the fact that St. Lucia is relatively better than the others, and they say, this is not a good region to go into anymore. So they classify all the countries together, they group the OECS, small island economies, tourism dependent, the debts tend to be relatively high, and they have restructuring taking place all throughout. Belize, some investors in St. Lucia lost money on this. St. Kitts investors in St. Lucia lost money on this. So this is important. And what we see, we saw it last year. Last year we tried to raise 266 million in bonds. We were only able to raise 45 million. Only 45 million last year. Oops. I'm trying to compare this to... So if you look at the track record, essentially, this is essentially... Well, you can't compare it because this is gross figures. I'm looking at a net figure. I'm looking at an absolute new financing. So the 122 you see here in 2013, the reason why it's different from the 45 is because you had rollovers in 2012. An important feature of those rollovers is that we didn't get 100% rollover. Essentially what happened is that some investors decided they did not want to hold on to the instruments. In some cases, we had to cash out, use deposits to pay them. And in other cases, what happened is that you had to find new investors to replace them, to replace the old ones who left. One interesting story also is the fact that you could get more short-term instruments. So if you look at the treasury bills, what we have, we wanted 43 in the budget, we actually got 59. That's one area where the market is still willing to provide financing, and there's a reason for that. Well, there are many reasons for it, but one is that the debt restructurings which took place in St. Kitts and Antigua did not involve treasury bills. So run to safety. So I do not want bonds. These are subject to restructuring. Treasury bills are not. Secondly, they have shortened the maturity of the treasury bills. So right now, if we want treasury bills sold, we don't go for not even 6 months. They do it every 3 months. So essentially every 3 months they could review and decide whether they want to keep the exposure or reduce it. And these are the reasons why the effort, you can't just stop the effort now. And what we have in this year is forget about new monies to finance this year's budget. What we have is roughly just under 500 million, which we have to roll over on the markets. Roll over meaning that you go to the investor and you tell them, it's due now, but hold it for another period. This is fine for the 277 million in treasury bills, because usually that's how treasury bill markets operate. You generally roll it over every period. For the bonds, that's a different story. Now, for the bonds, the story could be similar if market sentiments are positive, if they view St. Lucia very positively, if our fiscal deficit is below 3%, then the bonds probably you could roll it over easily. But when you have fiscal deficits of over 5%, or like we had last year of over 9%, you have debt over 70%, this is not guaranteed anymore. That this 197 million, individuals may decide they do not want to hold it again. Or what they may do is say, yes, initially it was 10 years, it matures this year, we'll renew it, but 1 year. So they give you an extension of only 1 year. What this does is that it increases the pressure on you. Because the following year, immediately you have to return to market to ask them, can you hold it again? What has been done in 2013-14? And this is important because we need to show that adjustments have been made. Sometimes I think when you listen to the discussion, it's almost as if nothing has been done and we just want to look at wages as the solution to all problems. But this is not accurate. The tax base has been broadened.
What slide number is that, please? Refer to it.
I would have to. Can I give it to you? Can I give it to you after? The tax base hasn't broadened, and this has meant adjustment for almost every St. Lucian, and it's broadened through VAT. And as you can see, the increase in revenue, which I mentioned earlier, was related to the VAT, broadening of the tax base. It wasn't really, we tried as much as neutral as possible to keep the marginal rate neutral, but what we had was a broadening of the tax base, so more people came under the tax net. And this allowed us to increase revenue by around 6%. The VAT impact is even more significant, given that the remainder of the tax base, some portions of it actually contracted. If you look at corporation tax, that was down by a bit. If you look at taxes on imports of goods and services, import duty, that also fell a bit. So this was important. Also, we have reduced recurrent expenditure by a significant amount. Goods and services and utilities, 8%. Supplies, 4%. Communications, 28%. Transfers, the subsidies which I spoke about, 56%. And to the private sector, the smaller transfers to the private sector by 45%. This is all adjustment. And if one believes that if there is an adjustment in wages, now I'm not making a case for one or the other at the moment. All what I'm saying is that if the belief is that when you do these adjustments, it's going to have some impact on the economy, it cannot be only for wages that it will. It would also be the same if you reduce supplies by 4%. Because at the end of the day, it's businesses which government purchase these items from. So that's 4% less business they have. So there is the notion that if you do the wages, the retailers will get less money, therefore they'll have to lay off people. But if government go directly and let's say, if we reduce communications, let's go to extreme case to zero, then cable and wireless and, sorry, Lime and Digicel would be in significant problems because government is a big consumer of the items. With natural light and we shut down all, there would be significant implications. So the notion that it's almost as if it's only if you do it to wages you would have those secondary effect is not correct. Also, we have rationalized capital expenditure. And we put the 26.8 million here versus the 25 point something percent reduction I saw. This 26.8 million is actual adjustment. It's not because we didn't get grants and didn't spend. This is actual reduction in the capital program, which has implications. It has implications. Because this money could have, you could have used it to do more road maintenance, more road improvement, and whatever. Further effort is required. Why? Our recurrent, like I said, would be 76 million if we do not do anything based on the basic formulation. We don't adjust wages. Now, this 76 million recurrent already involves further adjustment on the current side. This capital, now I need to explain this capital of 129 million. It's not the total sum of capital expenditure in the country for that we will be proposing in this budget. It's much bigger. This component is the component that we would need to go to the market and raise financing for. The other components of capital would be like the World Bank projects, for example, Hurricane Thomas and the trough recovery. These are funded through the World Bank. This would be in addition to this. Also, CDB loans would also be in addition to this. So this component, this 129, that's not all the capital expenditure. It's just what we need to go to the market to get financing for. The rest, we already have financing for it. This means that, in all, would need to go to the market for 205 million. This must be placed in the context that last year we went to the market for 221 million and we only got 45 million. We would need to go to the market and get 205 million. In the context whereby the market is saying, we don't like bonds, we only want treasury bills. Now, if you try and borrow 205 million of treasury bills on the market, you'd basically kill your treasury bill market. So you can't go that hard on treasury bills.
And then you have rollover from the last time.
Right. That excludes the 500 million rollover, which will be coming up this year also. And this 129 million in what we call kind of direct government finance capital expenditure is what we call a bare bones, and I'll go through it later and you'll see what's in there is basically fixed payments. Now, what has happened is that despite some of the adjustment we have made on the current side, which filters through the recurrent expenditure component, we need to make space, and we had 5.8% deficit last year. If we do not make more space, then what it means is that the deficit will go up because we need to accommodate these investments. These are long-term investments. These are strategic investments. Well, at least the new National Hospital, they are futuristic, and St. Jude's Hospital. This is an important part of the plan in developing the country's health infrastructure and probably looking at economic benefits which one can derive from this investment in health infrastructure. We need to accommodate this. We already have arranged the financing, and hopefully that should come through shortly with the Taiwanese government. So we need to accommodate this, and we need to accommodate this. And these are past payments, which we just meet in our obligations, which became due. And that's why we need to create more space, or else the deficit will go up again, and the markets will say, well, this thing you did there was temporary. It was a flash in the pan. You can't sustain it. So what's the general strategy this year? Continue on path towards fiscal sustainability, improve revenue collections without increasing any new taxes, work within the tax system we have now to try and improve efficiency, and do some alterations to it to hopefully increase more revenue. And we continue to work on our performance budgeting exercise. As you saw with the estimates, there's a new method of presentation where we try to get the ministries to account for the resources they have in a more systematic manner. And what we would like to do is to target a current account surplus, if possible, so we could have some funds to contribute towards capital, but most importantly, to signal to investors that this is a prudent country which tries to meet its expenses, and you should not be worried about investing in our debt instruments, and we are different from the other countries in the region. A case for wage adjustment. These are just scenarios. Once again, it was discussed with the unions just to look at some issues with it. First, this has been talked about a lot. There's a very low discretionary component of spending. First of all, current expenditure accounts for 73% of the current expenditure. Capital only accounts for 27%. Really and truly, you want more capital in there because that's what drives growth. That's what will, generate income for the future generation and also create the type of employment which we need. Now, if you look at the composition of current, which is important, 70% tied up in interest payments and wages. So if you say we're not doing anything here, then that's 70% of expenditure which you just cannot touch. You cannot touch interest payments, for sure. So this brings you to 70% of expenditure which you can't do anything with. Transfers, which is around $105 million, and 12% of your expenditure, this essentially is transfers to St. Jude's Hospital and Sir Arthur Lewis. So doing anything there would imply essentially maybe if you have to do, so for example, let's say we do a quarter of the adjustment just on transfers to 75 million. That means that you'd be reducing the budget of St. Jude's by 25% and the budget of Sir Arthur by 25%, Sir Arthur Lewis by 25%. So either you'd have a steep increase in fees, in health and education fees, or you'd have to have layoffs at these two institutions to make up for this. Then we go to goods and services, which is 167 million. But in there, around 75% of this, I think, accounts for supplies to the hospitals and to the schools. And if you listen to most teachers, they would complain about supplies. There's a constant complaint. And also at the hospitals, you'll hear that, you went to the hospital, there were not enough supplies. So this is where we are. The rest is rental, which are contractual obligations. Rental, what else is in there? So that communications, which would be electricity, water, and stuff like this. But around 75% of it is for supplies to the hospital and to the schools. And the ministry looks at these numbers very carefully. Last year's budget, we went through almost every item line by line, looking at how best we could rationalize these two categories. I would talk in the media, well, the ministry should look line by line. That's what we do. And we hold the ministries on a very tight, in fact, most ministries complain bitterly, but we look at it very carefully. And if you look at the expenditure which goes to, for example, the bureaucracy, which is just the government service, not the police, the hospitals and stuff like that. It accounts for a very small component of this. We've also reduced significantly on supplies for computers, for equipment, desks, what have you. Now, this is the point I want to make about this 129 million, which I spoke about, which we have to go to the market in addition to the 76 million in recurrent deficit, which we have to go to the market for. Further reduction is just not viable. DFCs, 21 million, 16%. The National Hospital, 13%, 17 million. Tourism marketing. Tourism was one of the sectors of the economy which held up last year. Held up very well, and so far indications are it should hold up pretty well again this year. 31% or 40 million. Then we have counterpart funding. That means that World Bank CDB projects, you have to contribute certain sections to it, certain amount of financing to it. That's 12 million. Agro processing, meat plants, that's important for agriculture. Infrastructure, 10 million. That's for the silting, road maintenance, road rehabilitation, everything you could think of on roads. And other stuff is in there for that 10 million. Only 10 million is in there. Then we have the catastrophic risk facility, which is an insurance mechanism for in case of natural disaster, 3.5 million. Other too small to mention of other stuff. In there, we also have the social programs, which is 11%. This is essentially what the $129 million is for. Now, based on ECCU guidelines, ECCB guidelines, expenditure should be around, wage expenditure should be around 9% of your total expenditure. Personal emoluments. All the countries are above this, which is probably why all the countries are probably facing the problems they have. If you think of it, Dominica did some adjustments earlier, which included, I think, 5% reduction in salary and 15% reduction in the public service. You can see Dominica is probably the best of all of them. St. Lucia is kind of in between at 53, St. Vincent and Grenada. It explains why Grenada is where it is, and it says that St. Vincent is interesting to say the least. 16%, and 63% of the current expenditure goes into salaries. So at least we should try and bring it down to maybe 50%, or if you want to be the best, go towards Dominica to 47%. Often, wages, the data on wages in the public and private sector we have. What we see is that the two have become unrelated. In the sense that if you think of it, up to 2003, they were tied together. If you look at this, from 1994 up to 2003, very tight together. They were moving in sync. So essentially, what was happening in the real economy was being matched by what was happening in the government sector. From 2003 and above, what you see is that the two moved apart. Public sector wages, if you were to draw a trend line here, on the upward trend. That's public sector wages, and this is private sector wages. And what we think has happened, there has been kind of delink of growth to wage increases in the public sector. Now, often the argument is pinned to cost of living, which is inflation. This is the usual argument which is used in negotiations, particularly by representatives of the civil servants, that inflation is driving it. But even when we look at inflation, we see a real increase above inflation for that period. What I would like to note about this is that the green bar here shows me GDP growth. As you can see, has been up and down kind of, and then low thereafter. This orange, I think this is orange, shows salary increases. Now, the story here is that during this period, there were at least 2 years of very strong growth. And one could argue that there was a basis at least related to growth for the wage increases in that period. But subsequently, what you've seen is that whilst growth hasn't done as well, you see that wages continue to outstrip it by a significant margin. Yeah, public servants. Now, this, I'm not going to go through this because I think I've touched on it before, briefly. But essentially what it says is that you can't pay wages to grow the economy. It's a formula which just does not make sense, and it has never happened anywhere in the world. Often you hear the argument that if you give me wage increases, it will stimulate the retail sector. That's not the way you grow an economy. You grow an economy by actually contributing to the real side of the economy, which is either you export more, or you have more foreign direct investment, which comes in, then it drives growth, and then you pay wages. So wages is the result of something. You can't use wages to generate growth. You would just get into a nightmare if you try to do that. And furthermore, to actually borrow to do it is really terrible. That's like, it's one of the worst things you can do, essentially. So what you need to do is to create space for investment, attract FDI, exports increase, then hopefully economic activity gets more buoyant, then wages would follow this. So wages, you pay high wages when you're rich. You don't pay high wages to get rich. Now, composition of the public sector. Let's look at the composition of the public sector and employment. This is one of the debates also you hear in the media. Civil servants account for 30. So we took two points in time, 2003 and 2013, just to see how it has changed over that period. And what we see is that it's remarkably stable. It's remarkably stable. Civil servants, they were 34%, now they're 31%. But look at the change in pensions. So if you do so there have been some degree of attrition, you would say, in the civil service, in that you have more pensioners, but they were not replaced, essentially. All the pensioners were not replaced, so you could see the attrition. But when you look at pensioners and civil servants together, it hasn't changed, the composition in terms of their contribution to overall employment.
Every year, annually, for pension?
64 million. Yeah.
That is in addition to the wage rate?
Yeah, yeah. In the wage bill of 450 million or thereabouts, yeah. Teachers, 20%, remarkably stable. Police, 10% compared to 9%. So it's remarkably stable. I need to go through it. Top management, 1%. So it hasn't grown faster than the rest of the service.
Explain top management.
Top management between grade 19.
That's the one of the beasts.
Yeah.
That all top management is costing the country millions of dollars.
We'll go through it at the exact numbers just now, but top management essentially is between grade 19 to 21. It has not increased from where it was in 2003 in terms of the composition of the service. Now, there's this other component, and I'll get to it because I think it creates some excitement, especially when we present it to the unions. So I'll go and explain. I'll show some table explaining exactly what is in other, because this is apparently something that's where the so-called consultants are. So here's the composition of other. Now, this is just a report which you pull out from the system, and the system does various groupings, and it has chosen these groupings. We're not trying to say whether it's rational that these groupings are, but this is what other has in it. Members of Parliament and the judiciary. The Governor General, Speaker of the House, ministers, parliamentary representatives. That's in that other category. The legislature, here. Consultants, what you could call pure consultants in the government, 13. Labor specialists, project engineer in health, telecommunication specialists, the ambassador to ALBA. These are the 13, which is classified as that. These are all. This is what is included. The constituency officers, that's administrative staff and cleaners, there are 23 people thereabout in there. Then the projects, which is why I think the confusion is, when they pull up that report and people in Treasury can have access to it, you see 107 individuals in this, but these are project managers, so it includes St. Jude's. Any project you have with the World Bank, CDB, they usually want you to set up a project unit for it. And this is where this thing falls. So St. Jude's, Thomas Reconstruction, health, education, agriculture, different projects. To manage a specific project, you get these individuals there. So they are, as you can see, it's broken down into a number of individuals. You have project managers who would probably be paying in the slightly higher pay bracket. Then you have project officers, research officers, technical staff, IT, administrative, cleaners, security. This is who falls under this famous component. This shows the distribution of employment in the public service. And it moves from grade 1 to grade 21. The bulk of public servants fall from grade 16, and certainly you could say grade 12 below. This is the bulk of public servants. And it's one of the difficulties if you will, although you could say there are equity reasons to look at it, but this is one of the difficulties if you say, let's do wage adjustment, but let's ignore most of this, and let's go, let's say, from here to here. Because look at this. This is significant in terms of quantum. This is 19, 20, 21. And we see it in the distribution of the payments also. So here are the 8 to 9,000. I think this is where the ministers fall into. 8 to 9,000, and that includes the ministers. And that's not only the minister. That number there is not only the ministers, but that's where they fall into. So this is everybody in the service who gets between 8 to 9,000. So where do we spend the money? We spend 1.8 million on grade 1, 10 million on grade 2, 24 million on grade 3, 45 million on grade 4, 60 million on grade 5. I think grade 16, which is the core, grade 14, which is essentially your technical, a lot of your junior technical officers, we spend 92 million in that category. So if you see the distribution, then we go into the top management. You have to have top management in any institution. But let's think of it. If we were to, I like to deal with extremes because extremes help you put things into perspective. Right. If you got rid of all these categories, you just got rid of them, and you say you don't need managers in the service, you don't need deputy PS, you do not need ministers. Just to make the point, let's do the extreme. You get rid of all of them. That's 9, 12, 15 million or 16 million you have saved. And you have gotten rid of all your top management, including ministers. I think judges are also in there, in that category. Judges, the magistrates, you have gotten rid of all of them. You saved 13 million. You have not reduced it by 5% or 10%. You have gotten rid of every single one of them.
Just a quick question. This is for the current period. Do you have any graphs showing a comparative?
But this helps you explain it because the composition, this is why I put on this chart. You could see the distribution has not changed. It is from 2003, and we just pick points. If we want, we could go through it. But what we see is that the composition of the service has not changed. So that tells you that even if you were to do it for a time series, you would see no difference in the numbers because the composition has not changed.
All the numbers?
Well, there would be some changes, but it's not significant because what you're saying is that the number of people you have in the various categories, when you do it as a percentage, has not changed. So we still spend the same proportion of people who are in grade 20 and above are still the same proportion relative to the size of the service. Now, it would be very difficult to see the service growing, and it grows only through here. So essentially, if you wanted to see the top go down from the 1%, you would say, okay, it grows by X% in all other categories, but you freeze these. You stop the magistrates, you stop promoting people to grade 19 and 18. This includes grade 18, by the way. I think this, so this is 21. If you look at it, these are the grade 20s and 21s, grade 19s. So this is it, 14 million. So if we were to impose this as a solution, you still have a $60 million gap in your recurrent. And you do not have any management, nor do you have any ministers, or they would do it pro bono.
That's a good idea, Mr. PM. Pro bono.
So then we go to the conclude. Let me conclude by some three scenarios we just presented with the unions as to possible wage adjustments and what it would do. More an illustration to show that just like my extreme case of removing all the top management from grade 16 up will not dent it. If you do a broad cut, it will not reduce the problem, but what it will do is to help you move in the right direction. And what we see is that if you had a 10% adjustment, would save around 37 million. Would still have a recurrent gap of $39 million to finance. Recurrent gap is important because essentially what you're doing is that you're borrowing to repay debt and to pay for your ongoing expenses at very punitive interest rates. If you do it by bonds, minimum 7.5. Minimum 7.5 is what is going on. If we can get it on the market. Sorry. If a 7% adjustment, you would get 26 million. Now, let me explain what it means, the retrenchment equivalent would mean. What we did, we just say, if, for example, you wanted to save the 37 million, right? But you're not doing it through wage cuts, you're doing it through reducing the service, how many people you would have to lay off if you were to do it that way.
And your retrenchment equivalents are proportional?
Yeah, proportional across the board. What we do is that we look at each grade, how many persons how much money you would save from a 10% cut in each grade, and then you equate it to bodies in terms of how many individuals you would have to retrench from grade 1 up to grade 21. And the 5% adjustment, 18.5 million, and you're still left with a gap of $57.5 million to finance. Some of the implications of that, we just look at what it would imply for, workers in the various groupings of a 10% wage reduction. So a grade 1 would lose probably around $100 in income. A grade 21 would lose at least $1,300. A grade 14 would lose probably around $550. And a grade 10 would probably lose at least just under $400. Same thing if you look at the 7% reduction. A grade 21 would lose $900. A grade 14 would lose roughly $350. A grade 1 would lose around maybe $60, $70. A 5% reduction, grade 21, $625 roughly. Grade 14, roughly $250. Grade 1, around $40 thereabouts.
What was the range of salary for grade 1 again?
For you know? Grade 1, what's the salary? 93. Some conclusions. High fiscal deficit is not desirable. It's never desirable. You get into real problems if you continue to have fiscal deficits of... So let's just assume, if you have fiscal deficits of 5% for the next 5 years, you would on average increase your debt GDP ratio by 25%. You would have to net off some for if you have growth. So if you're in a high growth environment, if you're growing at 5%, then that's not really a problem because essentially your growth is, so you'll keep at least the debt GDP ratio stable. But if you're in a low growth environment, then it means that every year you'd be adding almost 5% to your debt. So very quickly you would get into the above 100 category, which we think is a sure bet that countries become totally almost impossible to manage them after that. And that's why you see most of the countries with over 100% have had to do IMF programs. Another feature of the countries with 100% debt is that most of them did it through their domestic systems. Because usually by the time you get to 70, 80%, foreigners will not lend you money again, generally speaking. Jamaica, what they have done is that the financial sector lends them a significant amount of money. And that's why when people talk about the difficulty of the Jamaica adjustment, that's it. Because even with debt restructuring, if you impose a cost on your domestic financial sector by giving them haircuts, then essentially a whole sway of financial institutions could come under significant duress. And you could have collapses in the financial sector, banks being unable to survive. In which case, usually what happens is that the government then has to come in and recapitalize these banks, add to their capital, which then you're back to square one. And that's the difficulty of the Jamaica type adjustment. St. Kitts were lucky in a sense that they had a land swap to take care of that adjustment between the domestic financial institutions and the government. They did land swaps for it. Because they had the sugar lands, it was on the books of technically it was kind of a mortgage, so you just do the swap. You give them the land and they write off the debt against the land. So it's still a vulnerability on the financial sector, but at least it helps if you could manage the process. Adjustment for reduction of productive investment is not viable. It makes absolutely no sense to reduce capital expenditure and borrow to finance wages, because you're essentially preventing or retarding your growth. Even if, with the scenarios of wage adjustments we have done there, you're still at risk of disorderly outcome that, the thing could erupt. But why we think it won't is that if you were to do it, we moved from 9.2% of GDP to 5.8%. If we were to move towards 5, we were at 5.8 last year. If we were to move towards 5%, you could tell the market we're making significant efforts and it's consistent. We are going in the right direction. And this will engender some confidence, and you would have a greater chance of trying to get your debt sold on the market. And this is the whole idea behind this. Without wage adjustment, capital on the risk of being eliminated. If we go to the markets for this 205 million and we do not get it, during the year, you would have to do the adjustments. Now, if we look at the composition of adjustment of expenditure, we welcome anybody to look at it with us, to tell us how they would manage to do it, because most of them now have become fixed commitments. Most of it now is fixed commitments. And as I said, without wage adjustment, deficit rises again, and the gains from last year would be lost. So you go back and you say, like I said, they would say, this is temporary, you're not committed, you did well last year, but you're back up again. And we'll have no story to tell the markets. Thank you.